Because it wanted the prison to be beyond the reach of the US courts. It's that simple. So then you have to say, why would they want to establish a prison on a US naval base where they could evade all scrutiny from the courts? And the obvious answer to that is that they wanted to be able to do whatever they felt they wanted to do with the prisoners without anybody interfering with them. And you know, and then quite swiftly you understand that they wanted to be able to abuse these people without anybody seeing what they were doing. And you know, and I think that very genuinely was the case. And you know, and it took 2.5 years of lawyers acting on behalf of the prisoners before they managed to secure a ruling from the Supreme Court that the men held at Guantanamo had habeas corpus rights. In other words, that they could ask an impartial judge why it was they were being held. And that was what allowed attorneys into the prison to meet with the prisoners for the first time. And once that happened, then the Bush administration could no longer hide everything that it was doing behind this veil of secrecy. But you know, as I say, that took nearly 2.5 years, and you know, and a lot of abuse took place during those 2.5 years. Well, the basic way to look at this is that if you or I are going to be apprehended in any way and deprived of our liberty, there are only two ways that that can happen in countries that claim to respect the rule of law. If you're going to be openly a dictatorship, then you know the rules don't apply. But from what we understand, if we're accused of a crime, then we should be put on trial, and trials are supposed to take place fairly swiftly. Otherwise, if we're captured allegedly on a battlefield during wartime, then we're supposed to be removed from the battlefield and held unmolested until the end of hostilities. You know, and that literally means that you aren't allowed to engage in coercive interrogations. So what the United States did by coming up with this notion of unprivileged enemy unprivileged enemy belligerents, I think was one of their terms, unlawful enemy combatants, all basically, you know, things that they invented was to create the notion that the people that they were holding had absolutely no rights whatsoever as human beings. And, you know, that is exactly what happened at Guantanamo. And that's why, you know, we had this extraordinary situation where eventually, as I said, you know, in June 2004, after the prison had been open for nearly 2.5 years, the Supreme Court said that the men had habeas corpus rights and that they could be represented by attorneys and that they should be able to ask a court why they were being held, because they recognized that there were men at Guantanamo who said, you know, I shouldn't be here. I was caught by mistake, but there is literally nothing that I can do to, there's no forum that I can go to establish whether what I'm saying is correct or not. A really extraordinary situation for people to have ended up in. And, you know, and that remains really the fundamental problem with Guantanamo, as we've seen for the last 4 years, is that Donald Trump didn't want to do anything with the men held there. He had no interest in releasing anyone. And there was no body that could compel him to do so. Essentially, the prisoners at Guantanamo are still the prisoners of the US president and of the US Congress, rather than the law. Sure. Well, you know, obviously establishing things with any degree of certainty is difficult because of the whole vagueness of the Guantanamo operation. But you know, I'm pretty sure, and and there is evidence to back it up, that no more than a few dozen of the people who have been held at Guantanamo over its nearly 19-year history were connected in any meaningful way with terrorism. Now, it's a different matter if you're talking about military activity, because you're talking about people who were foot soldiers in Afghanistan in what was a civil war between the Taliban and the Northern Alliance. But that suddenly, after 9/11 and the US-led invasion in October 2001, morphed into the United States war on terrorism. I also think that hundreds of the men who were held at Guantanamo were absolutely unconnected with even any kind of military activity. So, these are men who were rounded up because of very poor intelligence in Pakistan, for example, in house raids, or they're people who were in Afghanistan but who were not engaged in military activity. So they clearly were people in Afghanistan who were economic migrants, who who'd been told the Taliban was running this pure Islamic state where you could live really cheaply. There were people who were there for humanitarian aid projects, and there were people who were there as missionaries. But the one of the problems is that if you've got a whole load of these guys who were foot soldiers for the Taliban, or for for Arab forces who were supporting the Taliban, then they should have been held as prisoners of war. And what I find one of the most extraordinary things about Guantanamo is that actually the US has muddled up the notion of terrorism and being a soldier, so that it suggests to the world that all the foot soldiers that it's holding are actually terrorists. And then, to complicate matters even further, the handful of people it's got who are allegedly involved in terrorism through Al Qaeda and associated groups, terrorism is a crime. But instead of holding these people and charging them in a federal court for a crime, which they were perfectly entitled to do, they actually tried to pretend that this form of terrorism was not a crime as we understood it, and have just completely muddied the waters there, because they've almost allowed anyone who was involved in Al Qaeda to pretend that what they were involved in was a war rather than an act of terrorism, which is a crime. So I think on every level, the way that the United States designated people and tried to justify what it has done at Guantanamo has failed, has just been wrong in every way possible. But it is really important to remember that there were reports from people in the know inside the administration who said that there were no more than a few dozen people who had any kind of middling leadership role in Al Qaeda or any other organization at Guantanamo. And the only thing that changed was that in September 2006, when George W. Bush emptied the CIA torture black sites that he had up till that point said didn't exist, he moved 14 men to Guantanamo, bumping up the number of people who were held there who he could claim were involved in any kind of way with terrorism. So, that's why I have over the years ended up saying that it's really no more than between 3 and 5% of all the people who've been held at Guantanamo who had any meaningful connection to terrorism. Well, through a variety of means, really. I mean, the first thing to understand is that when the United States said that all these men were captured on the battlefield, that was a total lie. No one was captured on the battlefield. One thing that's a problem is that the United States, through its PSYOPs operations, was offering bounty payments, and so was distributing leaflets that it was dropping from planes in Afghanistan, saying to people, pay for your village to live well for life, hand over the Al Qaeda terrorists. So any foreign Muslim had a bounty on his head, and a significant bounty. I mean, if you're paying $5,000 for prisoners in Afghanistan or Pakistan, that's a colossal amount of money, you know, in that part of the world. I mean, the equivalent to, you know, up to $250,000 is the equivalent for what was being offered. But you know, a large number of prisoners were captured crossing from Afghanistan into Pakistan in December 2001. Now, this was the time of the showdown between Al Qaeda and the U.S. forces in the Tora Bora Mountains. Actually, the U.S. forces were involved in bombing raids, but it was Afghans on the ground who were doing the fighting, and it was a mixture of allegedly, you know, soldiers associated with Al Qaeda and the Taliban. People crossed into Pakistan and were arrested, and everyone who crossed into Pakistan and was seized and sent to Guantanamo was accused of being a fighter. But whether or not that was true was open to question, because actually huge numbers of people were fleeing the death and destruction of the US-led invasion of Afghanistan. You know, men, women, children, fighters, civilians. So even that isn't clear that all of these people who they said were fighters were. Then you've got another group of people in Guantanamo who, as I mentioned earlier briefly, were captured in house raids in Pakistan, many dozens of them. And the house raids in Pakistan seem to have been based on spectacularly poor intelligence a lot of the time. Literally, people who were teachers or charity workers, foreign nationals, were rounded up. And, you know, and it's hard not to conclude that that was because the Pakistanis had been offered a lot of money. And in fact, President Musharraf boasted in his autobiography in 2006 that in exchange for handing over hundreds of foreign-born terrorist suspects, the Pakistani government received millions of pounds from the United States government. So, you know, yet again, you can see the rationale for saying there's a foreign Muslim with a beard, he's a terrorist. Really quite shocking, the poor intelligence that was involved in these house raids. And then the other group of prisoners at Guantanamo, I think about 40 in total, were people who were captured in various places around the world and who were subjected to extraordinary rendition and the CIA black site program, or in some cases, not the black sites that were run by the CIA, but proxy prisons that were run by other governments where prisoners were sent to be tortured as well. So that's the kind of total picture of who's at Guantanamo. In the black sites, yeah, they were subjected to a variety of forms of torture that had been approved in memos that were written by legal advisors to the Bush administration, who clearly shouldn't have been approving the use of torture at all, but did. So, you know, the most extreme form was waterboarding, which is a form of controlled drowning. But there were all kinds of other torture techniques that involved, you know, being hung in painful positions, use of nakedness. So prisoners were kept naked and very cold. They would have water thrown on them. They were dressed in nappies. Just a horrendous list, really, of things that the United States shouldn't have been doing, because it's a signatory to the UN Convention Against Torture. But, you know, this was the very specific torture program, and these techniques, I believe, were applied to over 24 prisoners, but there were at least 119 who were held in the black site program, who were subject to maybe slightly less horrible treatment. But it's also worth bearing in mind that this kind of horrible treatment was taking place at Guantanamo as well in the first few years, when there were different agencies in different parts of the military that had different ways of operating. So the ones that were interested in securing evidence that could be used in the event of a prisoner being put on trial, as well as plus the fact that these people respected the law, meant that interrogators would build a rapport with prisoners and try to get them to talk about what they'd done in their lives on that basis. There were other agencies that had just, been told to go in there and mess with people, and were given a certain amount of free rein. When we saw this happen in Abu Ghraib in Iraq as well, as to the ways that they did that. So, prolonged sleep deprivation, for example. In Guantanamo, they moved people from cell to cell every few hours. In some cases, they did that to people for months. And then they had the nerve to call it the frequent flyer program. But, they blasted loud music and at people. They made them be naked. They shackled them in painful positions. They threatened them with dogs. If they were particularly devout religiously, then they got women to behave sexually with them. The cells were freezing cold or they were boiling hot. All of these things, and some of these things overlap with what the CIA was doing, and some of them were, if you like, more regional things that were particularly applied to Guantanamo. Well, the intention was to secure actionable intelligence, but actually, skilled interrogators would always say that isn't the way to get actionable intelligence. The only good way to get intelligence is to build a rapport with the person that you're interrogating. So, I think some of that was a fundamental misunderstanding of the way that interrogations operate, which people like Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld didn't really seem to care what the skilled interrogators told them. But I think we could infer from that behind a lot of what the United States was doing after 9/11 was vengeance. It was driven by vengeance. It was driven by a desire to punish, and so some of the things that they were the dehumanizing things that they were doing to people were, I think, based on the fact that they wanted to punish somebody. But at the same time, what was happening was, it seems to me, a genuine but profoundly mistaken belief that that they would get information from people by abusing them horribly, and that's simply not a good thing to do. What you do not get reliable intelligence, even removing from it the whole moral angle of what it does to you as a nation, to engage in this kind of torture. It's really not sensible. How do you know what is true and what isn't when you're torturing somebody to give you information? And in fact, the FBI complained that after the torture had been taking place, they were spending a huge amount of time chasing all of these leads that had come from torture sessions with various prisoners, all of which turned out to be wild goose chases. Well, the main thing that's revealed in those files is, which doesn't leap out at you immediately, so you have to spend some time looking into them, is that they actually name the people who made the allegations against their fellow prisoners. And a lot of the so-called evidence about who people in Guantanamo are comes from statements that were made about them by their fellow prisoners. And there are many of their fellow prisoners who lied. Now, I'm not blaming them for lying. Um, if you're dragged out of your cell at 2 o'clock in the morning every night and put in an interrogation room and shown photos of people and told to tell them what you know, then, I can very readily understand how people crack under the pressure of that. People were bribed. They were, it was a very, very uncomfortable life with nothing comfortable in Guantanamo. And imagine if you're told that you can have comfort items. I don't know, you're going to be allowed cigarettes if you want, or you're going to be allowed to watch TV or to see films, which nobody else is allowed to do, or whatever. We know that these things happened. So as I say, I wouldn't blame anyone for having told lies about their fellow prisoners, but the files actually enabled us to see how repeatedly certain people were making allegations which were actually untrue. And some of that came about, it's external to the files. So the files provide the actual names. The context for it is, for example, a story came out well before the WikiLeaks files were released about when they were having an administrative military review of the prisoners at Guantanamo. For the military to decide whether it was right to keep holding these people as enemy combatants without rights. The men didn't have proper legal representation, and they weren't allowed to see the classified evidence against them. But they were assigned a military official who was their kind of guide through the process. And depending on who the military official was, they either took an interest in the prisoner or they didn't. But one of the men who did, he was so intrigued by the fact that the man he'd been assigned was absolutely furious when he was told, you were in Afghanistan at such and such a time and you attended a training camp, that he went away and had a look at the man's file and saw who had accused him of this. And then he went and checked the files of other prisoners to find the same man had repeatedly been accusing people of being in places when they weren't even in the country at the time. So, it's things like that. If you were to sit down with one of the kind of fanatical right-wing pro-Guantanamo American people from some of those dubious organizations in the United States, they would tell you that everything in these files is true. Which is completely implausible. It's really a bit like people who claim that everything in the Bible is true, and it's like, what, even all the contradictions? The files, the information in the files is not coherent. It's full of all kinds of broken bits and pieces, but it's really fundamentally very, very important for people to understand the extent to which the supposed evidence is based on completely unreliable testimony made by the prisoners' fellow prisoners. And unfortunately, I have to say that isn't something that became as widely known as it should be. And one of the reasons for that is that within a week of those files being published, which, as you mentioned, I worked on with WikiLeaks, within a week of them being published, the United States decided that it was time to take out Osama bin Laden. And suddenly the entire Guantanamo narrative was swept away, and the right wing in the United States was able to claim falsely that it was the use of torture and the existence of its post 9/11 prisons that had led to identifying the location of Osama bin Laden and being able to extrajudicially execute him as they did. When that simply wasn't true. The information that had apparently led to locating Osama bin Laden was not produced under the use of torture. Very specifically, some of it came from prisoners who were tortured, but it did not come from any session in which they were tortured. So actually, it disproved things. But it's always seemed troubling to me that somebody seemed to care so much about shifting the narrative away from Guantanamo, um, that Osama bin Laden's assassination took place at this time, even though I wouldn't really say that people were generally that interested in Guantanamo, because that sadly, I think, has been the case throughout most of its history, or certainly since the early days. I think in the early days when a lot of when European nationals were held there, for example, then eventually citizens of European countries started saying, what's going on here? This looks like a hellhole, this place. Why are our guys being held? And in my case here in the UK, there was still a lot of interest up until 2015, because the last British resident, Shaka Armour, was still held at Guantanamo, even though he'd long been approved for release. And when he was finally released, then a lot of the interest dissipated as well. But I don't think that Guantanamo has ever been as newsworthy and as significant to people as it should be, considering that a nation that claims to believe in the rule of law is holding these Muslim men at Guantanamo endlessly without charge or trial. Well, at Guantanamo, as I mentioned earlier, there was a whole abusive regime that took place in the early years. An insider who spoke to the New York Times many years ago reckoned that about 1 in 6 of the men were subjected to this whole process of moving around the cell, sleep deprivation, extreme use of hot and cold, shackling in painful positions, all of this abuse. I mean, a torture regime. So that was pretty awful. There were a handful of prisoners at Guantanamo who specifically had torture programs developed for them, because it was felt that they were significant individuals and were withholding information. But I actually think that, if we think ourselves into the position of what it's like at Guantanamo to wake up every day not knowing if you will ever be released, because nobody is charging you with any kind of crime. You're not allowed family visits. Even, let's say, you're from a family with money who could charter a plane and come and visit you. They're not allowed to. No visits. Imagine being in a prison on that basis. And I think that I think it's hugely significant that if you're given a prison sentence with an end date, that you know when that is, and yet it's open-ended, the imprisonment of the men at Guantanamo, as we've just seen from these last 4 years of Donald Trump, who didn't want to release anybody, couldn't care less about it, and and another, what is it, another 1,450 days or something has happened when those people in Guantanamo have been waking up with no knowledge of if they're going to die there, and whether they're going to die there in 5 years or 10 years or 15 or 20, never charged, never tried, never convicted of anything. That's extraordinary. And actually, a story that I've long remembered is that a representative of the International Committee of the Red Cross. Now, the Red Cross representatives are allowed to visit prisons to help to look after prisoners, but what they're not supposed to do is speak publicly about what happens. And in the early days of Guantanamo, the Red Cross representatives were so appalled by Guantanamo that they actually did frequently speak out publicly. And on this occasion, a man called Christophe Giraud said, and this was only in October 2003, so Guantanamo hadn't even been open for 2 years, and now it's nearly been open for 19. And he said, one thing that really concerns us is the effect of open-ended detention on the mental health of the men held at Guantanamo. And so I think it's that. I think that it is a form. It's a form of low-level torture. It shows absolute contempt for the rule of law, but it's that low-level torture of holding people with no end in sight to what's happening to them and no form of due process that is the most horrible thing about the place. Well, there were 40 men held at Guantanamo. So, um, of the nearly 800 men held, Bush released about 530, President Obama released about 200, and Donald Trump released one man. The one man he released was because he'd agreed to a plea deal in his military commission trial, which meant that in exchange for testifying against the men allegedly responsible for 9/11, he was sent back to Saudi Arabia to ongoing imprisonment in Saudi Arabia. And Trump, obviously, when first told this, would have said, I don't want to release anyone. But he was told by his advisors, you have to honor you have to honor a plea deal made in the military commissions. So he's the only person who got out. Trump might as well have sealed Guantanamo shut. He has entombed the men who are in there without hope for 4 years. So now, obviously, having Joe Biden in, knowing that some of the same people or people with the same mentality who worked with President Obama are going to be in the administration is a positive change. Now, having said that, the same problems that Obama faced will happen again. That Obama actually made a point of saying on his second day in office that he was going to close the prison within a year, and he left 8 years after coming to office without having closed it. He was confronted by horrendous, cynical obstruction by the Congress, the Republican-controlled Congress. And if Biden doesn't control the whole of Congress, then he's going to have problems. But, basically Obama was advised by various people close to him that it wasn't worth expending too much political capital dealing with Guantanamo. It wasn't worth prioritizing it to the extent of finding a way of shutting it. So, he contented himself with releasing nearly 200 men and leaving only these 41 for Donald Trump. But now that we've got a new administration, then the first thing we're confronted by is that 5 of the 40 men were approved for release by high-level government review processes under President Obama, but weren't released before Trump took office. So Joe Biden is going to be told this by lawyers, by NGOs, by all the people who are concerned about Guantanamo, which is a small but vocal group of people working within issues involving imprisonment and international law, fundamentally. But he is also, of the 40 men, only 9 of them are facing or have faced trials. There are 26 others who, for so many years now, since Obama did his reviews, he was told by the panels of military and intelligence people, oh, these guys are, they're too dangerous to release, but we don't have the evidence to put them on trial. So they're, the media in the States called them the forever prisoners because they are officially held indefinitely without charge or trial. Although there's a review process that that keeps taking place to establish whether they're apologetic. It's a parole type process. Are they apologetic enough about what they're alleged to have done, whether they did it or not? And have they put in place a coherent plan for how, if they are released, they will lead these wonderful, peaceful lives and, won't hold anything against the United States for what it did to them? That's the only way that these guys can get out as it currently stands. And honestly, some of those men, the only thing that they've done wrong since they were, a foot soldier in Afghanistan 19 years ago, is that since they've been held at Guantanamo, they haven't been very well behaved. They have resisted the terrible conditions of imprisonment at Guantanamo. Some of them have been on hunger strikes. Some of them are people who have shown leadership abilities and have been able to organize their fellow prisoners to demand rights. I think that I'm hopeful that the lawyers and the NGOs and all the various people who are able to at least get into the Biden administration to talk to people now will be able to get across this message that it's intolerable, nearly 19 years since this prison opened, that people are still held indefinitely without charge or trial on this nebulous basis of the threat that they allegedly pose. And what we've seen with the so-called intelligence, with the so-called evidence over the years at Guantanamo, when it comes to Obama's reviews of the prisoners, is that there is an institutional caution about releasing prisoners, about, about taking the extra step to say, I think that this person should be released from here now. And part of that has been in response to the Republicans, repeatedly trying to portray everyone at Guantanamo as a terrorist. And partly it's come from actually within the administration, who every 6 months they issue these intelligence reports about the number of people held at Guantanamo who have apparently re-engaged in terrorism. And, those numbers always seem to be very high, and they're never backed up with any kind of evidence that can be objectively analyzed to assess whether there's any truth to it or not. So, yeah, I'm hopeful that that change is possible. I wouldn't quite go so far as to say that I can see Guantanamo closing, the light at the end of the tunnel. But I think we're back on track to at least start seeing prisoners released from Guantanamo and reducing that population, which is, extremely important. Well, yeah, well, I mean, Ahmed Ravani is definitely one of the hunger strikers. I don't know, to be honest, how many of the men still held are on hunger strike. I think one of the Afghans still held has certainly been on a hunger strike recently. I don't think there has ever been a time in Guantanamo's history when there haven't been people on hunger strike, because when you are completely powerless, the only power you have left is the control of your own body. That's what's always happened in cases of prisoners held in unjust conditions, wanting to protest about the nature of their confinement. So that is still happening, and as I say, throughout Guantanamo's history, it's happened a lot. And there was a prison-wide hunger strike in 2013 that involved a significant number of the prisoners. And the military used to report how many people were on a hunger strike until they worked out that actually it would be better for them in terms of PR to not. And then they stopped revealing publicly how many people were on hunger strike, and they've never resumed telling us since. So, just another part of the everyday secrecy of Guantanamo Bay, which still exists. Well, I would hope that they would follow my work through my own website, andyworthington.co.uk, but also through the organization that I co-founded with the U.S. Attorney Thomas Wilner in 2012, which is called Close Guantanamo. That's closeguantanamo.org. And I've been running a photo campaign there for many years, where I have posters that are available every 100 days showing how long Guantanamo has been open, and we're coming up on 7,000 days, which is in February, I think. But I would hope that people would like to join us and get involved in that. Obviously, there's a coalition of various organizations that work on trying to get Guantanamo closed. Every year we hold a rally outside the White House. I've been going there for 10 years. I very much doubt that I'll be going there this January, January the 11th, the anniversary of the opening of the prison. But, it involves Amnesty International. It involves the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York. It involves Reprieve. So that, those are organizations that I would encourage people to look into as well. And thank you so much for your interest in this, because this is a huge human rights abuse being perpetrated by the United States, which claims to be a country founded on the rule of law, which respects the rule of law, but at Guantanamo is still fundamentally behaving like a dictatorship. Well, I suppose in Iraq there was already an Iraqi government at that point, wasn't there? There was a post-Saddam Iraqi government, so procedures had to had to be gone through, which I'm sure everyone involved knew was going to end up with his execution. But the illusion of justice, if you like. I mean, quite often I suspect justice is like that, especially in the cases of people who are accused of, horrendous crimes, is that the outcome is pretty much predetermined, but you go through the motions of having a prosecution and a defense. The killing of Osama bin Laden was just a total kind of Wild West extrajudicial execution, as far as I can see. It's like, wait a minute, if this is the guy who was the head of it all, why did you not try and capture him? Why did you, you were so driven by vengeance that you wanted to just murder him. Did you not think that if you captured him and gave him to skilled interrogators, you might find out everything about everything that you wanted to know? Or what? Because it seems like what they ended up doing was actually feeding into notions that people would have of, like, they couldn't like keep Osama bin Laden alive because he knew too much about what they'd been up to. Vengeance, I think. For all the other interpretations that are possible, it's important. It's important to remember the driving vengeance, the revenge for 9/11, and every person who was captured and interrogated, they all remember being dragged out of their cells and interrogated with two questions: where is Osama bin Laden? Where is Mullah Omar? Those were, this was the absolutely relentless drive of the interrogation, was to locate Osama bin Laden, presumably so that he could be taken out. Well, I started this in the autumn of 2005, really. I'd written a couple of books about British counterculture, actually. And I was looking around for a project, and Guantanamo had been a place that had, interested me and infuriated me for many years. And I was curious as to who was being held there. So I set about trying to work out who was held there. And at the time, nobody knew. The British NGO caged prisoners had tried to put together a list, and so had the Washington Post. But nobody knew until the spring of 2006, after the prison had been open for 4 years, when the Pentagon lost a Freedom of Information lawsuit to the Associated Press and was compelled to release the names and nationalities of all the men held, and these thousands of pages of supporting documents that were the unclassified allegations against them, and the transcripts of these tribunals that they'd held at Guantanamo, this unfair process that was designed to rubber stamp their prior designation as enemy combatants. But there was information in there, and this was the basis on which I wrote my book, The Guantanamo Files, which came out in 2007. And it's the basis on which I kind of got to know who everyone at Guantanamo was to some extent. And what I was telling you at the start of our conversation about where the people were captured, all of, I became the kind of custodian of the men's stories in a way. And I've carried on being that. And so the reason that I can't give it up is because it's still open, and it really, really shouldn't be. And the reason that I got involved and the reason that I'm so dogged about it is because this is such a particular crime that is being committed by the nation that claims to be the beacon to the rest of the world, in terms of law and justice. Now that's clearly the illusion that that superpowers, that the strongest nations project this notion that they're good and benevolent, while in fact engaging in all kinds of monstrous behavior. I'm British. I can look on British history and see that we used to do that until the United States took over. But there's an astonishing hypocrisy in claiming to believe in the rule of law and holding people indefinitely without charge or trial at Guantanamo. And I care about the stories I care about some of the men who are held there. I found out about so many of them over the years who are genuinely very interesting people. That doesn't mean that there aren't bad people at Guantanamo, because clearly there have been some, and maybe there still are some. It seems that there are, although we never get proper trials to find out whether that's the case. But the issue is not just about the people; it's about the principles. And the principle is so important that you aren't supposed to hold people indefinitely without charge or trial if you respect the rule of law. That's why I can't really give up on it. And it should concern all of us that the reason that Guantanamo has remained open is not just that there are people in the United States who are obsessed with how all of these Muslims they rounded up are terrorists. It's the fact that the United States is getting away with holding people without any kind of due process. And, for the last 19 years, it's been Muslims. But it sets a precedent for a future Guantanamo in which another group of people who are regarded as an enemy can be imprisoned forever without charge or trial, because they've been getting away with it at Guantanamo. And so, fundamentally, I suppose, as the years have gone on, I end up using that word dictatorship more and more, because it's so fundamentally at odds with how America sees itself. And whatever are the broken problems with the United States judicial system on the US mainland, that most convictions are through plea deals, that the system doesn't work in so many ways. It still involves the notion that you have to have a trial, and there has to be a ruling at the end of it, a conviction at the end of it, and that's simply not true at Guantanamo, and that's unforgivable. So that's why I'm still doing it. Yeah, I think it must be. I mean, the Bush administration called them the worst of the worst, and it caught on. Americans were scared, and they were told to be scared, and then they were told by the Bush administration, kind of like daddy, don't worry, you can sleep safely because we've removed the threat. We've put these guys somewhere where they can't hurt us anymore. Don't think about it. Don't worry about it. Then there has to be an aspect of this that is racist. These people are Muslims. So this is an Islamophobic issue on the part of America being attacked by Muslims. And that undoubtedly plays a part in the story. But I think you're right. The sound bites are really difficult. Believe me, I've spent all these years, and I can come up with things that are quite catchy about, how a country that claims to respect the rule of law cannot hold people indefinitely without charge or trial. You know, if you listen and think and get your head around it, it's a big thing, but it's not as good as the worst of the worst. We put the worst of the worst in Guantanamo so you can sleep easy at night. It just doesn't, it can't match it. And unfortunately, um, you know, I worry because a populace that doesn't pay attention can be easily manipulated, and I think we've seen people being manipulated in all kinds of ways over the last 20 years, starting with 9/11, and that some of the ways that's manifesting itself, some of the ways that manifested itself, for example, with clearly a dangerous racist white supremacist in the White House, you know, ties into issues of race and the other and demonizing people and being told that you cross lines because that's the way that you stay safe. All of which, you know, is really, really not helpful at all and quite troubling.